Welcome back to HEP Talks Roundtables, where the big questions in education meet the sharp minds on the front lines. Since it's been a while, let's start with a little refresher. Roundtables is a HEP Talks series of podcasts that brings school leaders and thinkers together to discuss a single pressing issue in the education community. In this second episode on Ofsted, we're diving into the recently proposed changes to the inspection framework, what they say, what they really mean, and whether they hit the mark. Joining us for this episode, we have Jade-Simone Bacon, head teacher at St. Michael's CE Primary School, Lucy Walker-Collins, head teacher at Stroud Green Primary School, Stephen McNicholas, head teacher at St. John Vianney Primary School and Our Lady of Muswell Catholic Primary School, and of course, we also have James Page and Fran Hargrove, Chief Executive and Deputy Chief Executive of Harringay Education Partnership. The Roundtable covers the rise of report cards and toolkits, and whether exemplary is just the new outstanding in disguise. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. Let's get into it.
Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to see you all. And it's been a while since we had this self-same round table discussion with our focus being Ofsted, and much has happened since we spoke last. So on the line with us this morning, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. Start with you, Stephen.
Good morning. I'm Stephen McNicholas. I'm the executive head at Our Lady of Muswell and St. John Vianney.
Jade.
I'm Jade-Simone Bacon. I'm the head teacher at St. Michael's Church of England School in Enfield.
And Lucy.
Hi, I am Lucy Walker-Collins, head teacher of Stroud Green Primary School.
James.
Hi, James Page, Chief Executive of Harringay Education Partnership.
And I'm Fran Hargrove, Deputy Chief Exec of HEP. So this morning, I wanted to kind of throw a bit of a provocation out to you all. There's been a consultation has been published by Ofsted in response to the Big Listen, where they have taken everybody's thoughts and views and had a look at the Ofsted framework. A little bit in response to the coroner's verdict around Ruth Perry's very tragic death, and listening to the sector, including parents as well as education professionals. And they've come up with a consultation that has been released, which has been looking at taking away one-word judgments and overarching judgments, and looking at lots of different areas using a 5-point scale. And that scale is also come under attack today, where they might be looking at a bit of that. And they've published toolkits as well to go with the framework, which in principle are very helpful for schools to see exactly what they're going to be inspected against. But before I kind of put any of our views into that, I'd like to invite the panel to give their first impressions and thoughts to the initial Ofsted consultation. And I'm going to throw Stephen under the bus first.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. I'm just my initial reaction to it. The claim about it providing more nuance, I think, is in my mind directly linked to less accuracy. So I think more nuance, less accuracy is what I'm seeing on first reading of this. The amount of subjectivity that goes into coming up with those judgments is obviously going to make it more less accurate than this one. So that's I don't see nuance. I just see less accuracy.
No, absolutely. It is a 5-point system, 5-point grading system against 11 areas, and I think there is an enormous amount of nuance in the toolkit. Lucy, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree with Stephen. I feel like I would absolutely not be an Ofsted inspector, which I might have said last time, but any possibility of that, this is an unachievable thing to go into a school and mark and assess schools against that bit. From the Big Listen as well, there was a lot about the kind of impact and the support for schools. And I think just what Stephen's just said about it being kind of even wider and less accurate. How do you then ensure that that follow-on support for schools that need it is then bespoke and localized and contextualized and helpful and supportive? I think that bit's particularly lost. That kind of, that whole thing about it being for parents, I think we talked about last time again, and it's not necessarily the be all and end all, but moving forward as a school, is that report going to be useful to you? I don't see how it can be with the scope of what it's trying to cover.
I think, James, sorry, I'll bring you in a second, Jade, but James, you kind of summed it up, and I think I'll let you sum it up in the tight, loose piece.
Yeah, I think my worry is that we're flipping around from a framework currently, which was very tight on how inspection would take place in school, but being quite loose on and quite generic on how the reporting actually came out, to flipping it the other way, which was being much looser on how inspection actually happens, towards then also having much tighter reporting. And I think there's a real worry about how does that stack up logically, because if there is that much kind of variability and far less precision in the way that inspections take place, how do you convert that into the number of judgments all graded in every inspection going forward?
Yeah, it's going to be that real nuance that sits in between it, isn't it? And I think this is exactly where inspectors are going to really, really struggle with those kind of definitions. Jade.
Yeah, and I think, I think as leaders trying to prepare for this, we're going to be, I feel like there's a big workload concern as well. How are we going to be, we're going to be putting extra documentation together to try to prove these areas for somebody that's going to come in with the looser approach to inspection. So yeah, I feel like the workload's going to increase. And it's just a risk of overcomplication as well with the grades. It's just, again, it's just school performance is harder. It's going to be harder to communicate to parents. How are they going to understand this? Yeah, it just kind of rolls into many areas, really.
Yeah, there was an article in Schools Week just this morning around the secure judgment, and that perhaps parents might not understand what secure actually means. So they're starting to look at trying to rephrase that so that the piece that sits between attention needed and strong, and the starting point for any inspection is supposed to be at secure. But I've been racking my brains trying to think what you would replace secure with, and what a change of that word might do to how schools are judged. Are there any thoughts on that?
Well, I hope they don't come up with satisfactory, because we've all been there.
That before. Yeah, we've heard that before.
It's just another, a meaningless word. All of these descriptors underneath it that a parent doesn't know how this lovely report card is put together. The parent doesn't consider the sort of inherent lack of accuracy, the work that goes into it, the stress that goes into it. Of course, to like a nice one-page report card, but that doesn't mean it's okay to trounce over the experience of the last 10 to 15 years of Ofsted inspections. It's got to be reformed, and they just haven't listened.
Yeah, I do feel like it would just throw up more challenges in our public relations, even with governors, even maybe, just trying to explain what these different areas actually mean.
And I'm not sure that Ofsted necessarily know what they mean, right? Like the toolkits are there, but they're all very generic and very very kind of bland, I guess is the word. And there's that bit about localized context, but unless we're going to have, unless we ensure that our inspectors are local, how is that going to come through in a 2-day inspection?
Sorry, we've lost Lucy there a little bit. James, you had your hand.
Yeah, just to note that the language seems to have changed quite a lot. I was certainly noticing, that we started with well-being and being supportive with the sector and collaborative and everything else. And it wasn't necessarily Martin Oliver who was changing the language as such, but I just thought it was really notable in the Education Select Committee when Secretary of State and Permanent Secretary were giving evidence and their views on it, and talking about how inspections should be high stakes. and will be more rigorous.
Mm.
I think there's work to do on how to square that circle, I would say. My other thought is the moving away from the kind of the precision of inspection in the current methodology, and particularly thinking of deep dives and moving away from those, is whilst totally appreciate the pressure that deep dives have put on middle leaders and subject leaders, there's a degree to which I think that's driven such powerful change in the sector with the focus on subject leadership and doing that really rigorously. And I totally get kind of wanting to put senior leaders back in the driving seat whilst inspectors are on site. But moving away from that methodology feels like there's a real danger of regression on the quality of subject leadership. Not because anyone will actively want to reduce, that absolute focus on high quality subject leadership, but I just worry that whilst the curriculum remains in the framework, without that same focus in terms of how it's inspected, it's almost inevitable, I think, that across the sector, slowly, the tide isn't behind it in quite the same way.
Mm.
Yeah, I just think that's one of the best drivers for school improvement, in my experience as a school leader, was that what we teach the children, how it's taught, and how we support the teachers in teaching it. It was just so sharp, and of course it put pressure on middle leaders. But that's a learning curve. We're through that now, and I think those habits are embedded within schools.
Yeah.
It's embedded within schools. To throw all the chips up in the air again, as you say, inevitably it's going to just lead to that becoming loose again.
And forgive me if I'm wrong, but I felt like it's looking like we're going back to the lesson observations approach that we had before, which again, as you say, is a really loose approach and doesn't really help the improvement that we're looking for, that we have actually done quite well with the deep dives. But I felt like it was, let's go back to the lesson observations again.
Yeah.
Less informative.
That is a real concern, I think. Working with schools across the system, we've come so far from the very kind of snapshot accountability, and as one of our more flamboyant improvement partners puts it, seeing Billy Smart's circus lessons, that actually the deep dive methodology really pushes to quality over time, and it's wanting to see, and teachers are comfortable now, I think, or increasingly so, being seen and being observed and having lesson drop-ins from a range of people, from their peers to senior leaders to external partners for the school, being seen to be doing their day-to-day job rather than producing a lesson with smoke machines and all the rest of it going on, and that being a kind of a marker for how good a teacher you are. It's what is the bread and butter that the children are receiving over time, and I would worry that returning to a more snapshot accountability range of evaluation, not only from Ofsted, but then that obviously trickles into the practices of individual schools, will take that backwards. Lucy?
Sorry, still can't learn how to unmute. I wonder if, though, we are doing that thing that we do as teachers, like we ask for it to change and then it changes, and then now we're saying we kind of liked it how it was. That when the kind of the deep dives were obviously badly delivered, right, and the initial kind of fear that came out with them after that first tranche of inspections was horrible for everybody. But just listening to us now and being reflecting while people were talking, we're kind of now saying, oh, actually that was we really loved the deep dives and bring them back, and this kind of more holistic approach was what we asked for in our previous podcast, actually. And although I disagree quite strongly with the kind of presentation of it, of the areas and the sub areas and the report card and the toolkits, I'm just noticing that is perhaps what we're doing.
Yeah, there is an element of be careful what we wished for, because now we've got it, which I think is a strong piece.
Exactly.
Just like the thing, maybe I'm naive around this, but the thing that would from our point of view really transform any framework, whether it's the current one or the proposed one with its different areas, if it seems to be moving in the direction of what we're currently as in the Catholic education area. Section 48 inspections, very, very similar in terms of what Ofsted are now proposing, and having been through one of them in the last few weeks, it's awful. You know, it is genuinely awful. There's 9 different areas that gets extrapolated up to 3 judgments, that then gets extrapolated up to 1 judgment, and you know, the opportunity for error at every level is just huge. And at any one time, there's 76 descriptors in play, and you've got to think, well, how on earth can that all be wrapped up into a nice neat bow in a day and a half? I just wonder whether, you know, anyone will ever, you know, go to the system where have your descriptors and have as many of them as you want, have as many areas, but have the descriptors that go with them, but just write the report drawing language from those descriptors. Because if I got rid of my first, you know, the front page of my section 48, the report's absolutely fine, but the front page is the one that sort of confuses everyone and causes stress to everyone. And causes, you know, questions that can't be answered. You know, have the descriptors, write your report. What is the need? Why is there this need to extrapolate it up into a word or a number? It just doesn't make sense to me, and that's what I think. You know, I might be naive because, you know, it's a qualitative need for Ofsted to have the ability to sort of categorize and put into a spreadsheet the number of schools that are good at this, the number of schools that are exemplary at this. And, you know, it doesn't help the school get better. It just drives workload and stress, whereas descriptors can easily drive school improvement.
It's harking back to the first iteration of Ofsted. I went back and had a look at some of the very first reports that were ever done on those first Ofsteds in the kind of mid to late 90s, and they were pages long, but it was exactly like that. It was just, you know, it was very much more descriptive of where you were at, and then areas for suggested action. And whilst I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to a 5-day inspection with 20 inspectors with 6 weeks notice, they were better. They were far more evaluative, I feel, in their approach.
Yeah, just with what Stephen was saying about kind of the reading of the report versus the kind of categorization of the judgments. When we got ours at Stroud Green, we really felt like it read better than the grading, and so that part of it reads more like an outstanding score, but the grading was an ungraded inspection. So what I do like from the new framework is the fact that all inspections will be graded. I think that is a positive move. It's very frustrating, and with the workload implications and with the well-being bit, kind of to put yourself out there and ask for the regrade did feel kind of counterintuitive as a school leader. So the fact that that's come out of the new, or is proposed as part of the new framework, I do think is a positive move and should hopefully stop that, the imbalance.
No, I would agree with that. I think having one, because it got to the point where ungraded inspections and graded inspections were so very different that you ended up having to prepare for 2 types of inspections, and I think that was causing additional kind of confusion about the whole thing. So I think a move towards that, and I do believe, though I can't find it anywhere written down, that they're going to keep the Monday phone call. So inspections will be on a Tuesday and a Wednesday, which I would also be a significant positive in terms of managing stress and emotion around it.
I also think that the graded and ungraded was really difficult for parents to understand. And given that Ofsted kept banging the drum about this being for parents, I think bottoming that out and making it the same is also a good move for parent communication, because trying to explain to parents why it had or hadn't happened could be really challenging.
Absolutely. Jade?
Yeah, but it's interesting what Lucy just said earlier, because you know, you kind of have that who wants change, everybody, who wants to change, nobody kind of scenario. But it's you know, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, is it all negative? And I don't think there is. I think I'm still a little bit undecided. Is there maybe reduced pressure from a one-word judgment? So is that something that we can be, you know, looking at more specific areas? I don't know if we need as many as there are, but you know, that removal of that is potentially a better thing. You know, and does it create less risk of reputation damage. I'm still a little bit undecided, but that's what I keep thinking. It might be, you know, the overall grade might lend itself more to that.
No, I would agree with that. And we had Laura McInerney at the Governor's Conference, didn't we, James, a little while ago? And she was kind of quite positive about the whole thing. She was, you know, surprisingly so. And I don't think there's, I suppose, even the report card, I quite like the look of it, where you can kind of look at the different areas and click on them and have a bit more detail around them. And if that kind of pans out in a way that it could and should, I think there's nothing wrong with that if you want to look at a certain aspect of a school. I just think that they're going to have to get the it's the judgments that sit across the top, I think, could end up being problematic. And I think for me, the toolkits are a great way to communicate to schools about what is going to be inspected and how. But I think the language in it is so complex. And again, as we've gone back, there's nuance. And harking back to that kind of Schools Week piece again, that a little while ago they did a bit of a quiz of where does this phrase sit? Is it in secure? Is it in strong? Is it in attention needed? And on average, people got at least 2 to 3 of those wrong. And if you're doing that by poll, that would be my worry about the variability of inspectors' interpretations on that.
Definitely.
That's if you're looking at that particular area, the worst thing you can do in that situation is to confirm it by adding a number or a single word to it. You know, if you are unsure about where it fits across those descriptors, you know, that needs to be left unclear, and you can't sort of wrap it up and say, well, okay, I'm going to plump for secure, or I'm going to plump for needs attention, because that's what I have. If it's subjective, summing it up into one word is the problem, I think.
Also, we just waste so many. Oh, sorry.
Go on, Lucy.
So I just think we then spend, as school leaders, hours and hours unpicking these arbitrary phrases. That's what I'm worried about. Just like we did about the deep dive, right? About what does outstanding Spanish look like? What does outstanding P look like? I really worry that we get ourselves sucked into that. That's our next vortex we're going to get sucked into and get ourselves into a panic, because we want to do well and we want to represent our schools correctly, but because of this change, the shifting framework. I also just wanted to add to what Jade said about the reputation damage, not necessarily about the framework, but with the given like global and national picture of falling reception rates, I think no matter what happens with the Ofsted framework from the DfE, that it is higher stakes now. We do all know that if you get a negative Ofsted review, whatever, or inspection, whatever that's called now, I think that it's not Ofsted's job to kind of like counteract that pressure. I think that's something that they can't, it's not within their remit. But I think that's we also need to acknowledge, because even if they left everything unchanged, or even if they really stripped it back, the pressure is mounting every day because of that picture of not enough children and too many schools. And Ofsted is now being linked to that more than more, which I don't think was their intent, but it's happening.
No, absolutely. James.
I just wondered if we wanted to talk about the balance of using data again as well. With I think we can all probably agree that there was a specific context around taking data out almost completely through the pandemic, which made sense, and foregrounding the richness of curriculum over just what data may or may not tell us, in however reductive that can be. But equally, we can't take it out completely, and it is important how children are doing through national assessments. So I was very interested in everyone's views on how to weigh that, because at the moment it feels a little bit like going back to floor targets and seeing data as was pre the 2019 framework. But just where does the best balance lie?
Jade.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. I think A balance is a difficult one. I think I just feel like it is going to be really restrictive. We're going to start teaching to tests. That kind of approach is going to, the curriculum, the rich curriculums that we've all created and worked so well towards are now going to be, are they going to be reduced as we kind of become more focused on, the demand for immediate improvements from parents, governors, LAs, is everybody going to be really so scrutinizing our data to the point that we just remove all the things that we are enjoying doing around curriculum. I don't know what the balance is. I really don't at the moment, but
I share your concerns significantly, Jade, and I think it should be curriculum, teaching and learning first, data that follows. And like I say, and we've seen so many gains in outcomes for children with our renewed focused foundation curriculum areas. We've got a very clear causal link between the humanities curriculum and the reading test, which is a knowledge testing in disguise, and it'd be horrendous to lose those significant improvements.
I feel like it just goes to this whole thing about us being brave leaders and just trying to stick to what we think is really right for our schools and our our children above and beyond what they're asking for, and sticking to the things that we know are right. And we shouldn't have to be brave. We should just be able to do those things comfortably. Absolutely.
Lucy?
Oh, I welcome the return of data. Sorry, I think it's so long as it sits underneath that classroom experience. I didn't like the fact that there was no data in there. What frightens me, and I am saying frightened, because like Jade just said, we have to be brave, but there's been a breakdown of trust, right, from schools and with Ofsted. That bit about context, which I mentioned earlier, I do not understand how an inspector who may have never worked in a primary, I know they said they're going to sort that out as well, but they won't be able to, because there won't be anybody who wants to do it. It'll be a recruitment issue, but doesn't know the local area, doesn't know the school, doesn't know the history of the school, doesn't know, the challenge that week, that year. That bit they've put on the website on the consultation about learner characteristics, performance outcomes, absence and attendance figures, and local area demographics. They're going to do 1.5 days in my school, and they're somehow going to learn all that, as well as looking at the data and the teaching of phonics and all the other things that are in there, safeguarding and etc. So if that was, like you say, I don't want a 5-day inspection again with a 6-week lead up, but if that could be done, then I would be really happy. But what frightens me is that isn't possible, and so therefore you're going to have an inspector that probably hooks onto one detail, whether that's your free school meals pupils or your Black Caribbean boys or whatever that is, or your SEN data, and then becomes a focus of an inspection completely in a way that's just completely irrelevant to what your school's actually like, because that just isn't feasible. It takes a leader a year to learn that stuff and to really understand that stuff, living and breathing it every day. The idea that you'd walk in and have some stats from the DFE and then be able to use that to inform your judgment is frightening.
Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, I think I sort of, again, cautiously welcome the return of data, but my experience of data and Ofsted inspections has been, the old thing about data is that you can make it say anything you want it to say. So the difference between an outstanding school and one that's requires improvement can have exactly the same context and exactly the same data. But yet, it's been made to work in one's favor and not in another. So it's the consistency around which data is included in the thinking is the big challenge. I think, statistical relevance, simple things like, if you've got 6 pupils, it's not the same as, a percentage of them is not the same as a percentage of 57 pupils. Just real basics around it that were real problems in the bad old days. And I think, the hardest data to shift, obviously, is, send pupils and disadvantaged pupils. And I think if you're a school that's inclusive and works hard to include and provide well for those children, the idea that then can be used against you in a high stakes inspection is the worst of all possible worlds. So yes, I think we need data, but I think, you know, it's absolutely, as you said, Fran, I think curriculum, teaching and learning first. Context is absolutely vital, and they shouldn't come near our schools unless they've understood the context.
Yeah, there's a real argument for locality inspectors, isn't there, James?
The other piece that this links to, of course, is inclusion. And I don't just mean being inclusive of the students that are in your school once they're in there, which is obviously vitally important. But it also, what about the students who never came to your school? And how inclusive as a school are you, you know, compared to the local context and serving the local community? And I just feel like there's a real value in Ofsted really thinking hard about how to promote that and to challenge where a school doesn't appear to be, at least on the surface, as inclusive as it might be, and taking context more broadly on that. You know, and if your data is lower because you are providing for, you know, a cohort that has changed over time, has particular special educational needs or whatever else it might be, you know, that is putting pressure on overall headline data, just being able to be as careful as possible as that, and actually to celebrate schools that are highly inclusive. You know, in a way, should it be possible to even get strong, let alone exemplary, you know, if your school doesn't demonstrate that it is highly inclusive of those around you?
I think that's a really key point and piece of thinking. And this is going to be where I suppose my next piece is around inspector variability and what potentially Ofsted could do to mitigate, and I was going to use the word eradicate, but Ofsted inspectors are only human like the rest of us, so there's going to be no eradication. But what do you think could be done to kind of mitigate that real variability that we so often see? Stephen?
Unfortunately, it's keep it simple, isn't it? So don't make it more complex, make it less complex, but much more specific. And I think that's the problem. You know, the Ofsted inspectors that we have in our network here in Harringay and Enfield are worried about that sort of increase in complexity, increase in you know, the number of things they have to think about, juggle and make a judgment on. So you cannot increase complexity and expect increased accuracy. It just, you know, it can't be done. And consistency being the key, consistency is going to be, you know, almost impossible in that situation. It's just, you know, it's just so obvious that simplicity is what's needed. We could also get AI to do it. You know, you could just feed a load of documents into it and get AI to come up with, you know, a consistent outcome for everyone. Load your context, load your data, and off you go. I'm being flippant, obviously, but
Well, there might be something in it.
Mm.
Lucy,
I think
Chatty B's your good friend, isn't she?
She's my
So she,
bestie.
they, them.
I think there's definitely, we had this conversation last time about locality and about local heads supporting one another, about the systems we've got in place at Harringay and in Enfield of HEP and HEP, and how much more supportive and how much more impactful those relationships are than the Ofsted inspection framework and the Ofsted report. But I think what Ofsted need to do is a huge recruitment drive. Hi, Leonie, off you go, please. I think what they need to do is a huge recruitment drive where they say, we've got a new framework. We really want to work with you. We want local, as much, you know, where it can still be challenging and supportive. We want local head teachers to support other local heads. Here's an offer we can make you as an Ofsted, as a practicing head who's also an inspector. I don't know what that would be. I'm not talking about anything financial, but just some kind of CPD or something. And go back out and hold their hands up and admit that. Because at the moment, part of the anxiety and the stress and the well-being work is around the fact that we all know inspectors in our network, like Stephen says, and we all know that they're looking at this and saying it's going to get worse, not better. It's going to be even more dependent on the inspector, which was part of the stress last time. We all know these anecdotes and people that have those really negative experiences. So there needs to be a kind of DFE-wide push that goes, come and be an Ofsted inspector. This is why it's great. And then we will all see that. Whether or not we choose to engage with it, we will have the confidence that those inspectors are part of our networks. At the moment, it just feels like it's going to be so much more variable. Like Stephen says, it's going to be even less accurate than it was before. And that was already a huge part of our stress in the previous framework.
yeah, we've certainly heard the message loud and clear from a number of London inspectors that they are concerned about that. Jade?
Is this it sounds a little bit like what they're trying to pull together with the idea of RISE. I mean, that's James, you're involved in that, aren't you? But is that what the kind of approach that's supposed to be, where we get support from people who are local, who do understand our context and can support in a more focused way?
Quite possibly, still being worked through. But there are, I think, on the RISE side, what I would say is that there are. I think the initial reaction is that everything is about the targeted work, so the work that's going to intervene with schools that are struggling. Currently, that definition is at least 2 RI judgments in old money on Ofsted. But the number in London is absolutely tiny. So, so this is not going to be some enormous, expansive intervention work with lots of schools. The bit that actually excites me hugely is what we might be able to pull together from what's currently being called the universal offer. So being able to signpost and build a more cohesive school improvement map and offer in what is, I think, still a very fragmented system. So this is not about kind of moving towards full academisation or anything else, as the bill is very clear on, and RISE is very much the targeted bit, is very much about supporting schools in their current structure. But I think for me, building on something of, albeit the context wildly different, building on a bit of the context of London Challenge and bringing a sector together across the city, across the whole city, could be really exciting. So it's not about replacing any school improvement that already exists or anything else, but about tying things together. And maybe for those schools that don't get or take for granted the networks of support that some schools have, helping them to be able to navigate the system much more effectively. But it's there will be a tie-in with Ofsted judgments around which schools are eligible for the targeted support, but I don't think it really informs the universal offer, and that's the bit that I really want to focus on as a positive for the city.
I think we're at a point of quite significant change. We have to understand and recognise that actually the UK English education system is doing actually quite well. It's in a good place, compared with national, but there's a lot of disparity across the country, and the pressures that we might be feeling and where we are going to be very different to those that perhaps in areas that have a lot of very small schools that are very fragmented and very, very isolated. So I think there's a real role for RISE teams, especially around the universal offer, to actually start to share some of the excellent practice that we've seen in London, where we're a lot more kind of locality connected. We've got a lot more glue available to us to keep the system going and together. And it'd be interesting if they're going to have a far more in-depth framework around this as to what the key and common themes might be that come out of inspection. And whilst the kind of focus for Ofsted is, it's for parents, I think there's a role that they need to recognise about feeding into the broader system, about the kind of the key themes and challenges and areas of success that might exist across the country, which might inform other work with other teams, just like the RISE team, perhaps. But thinking about the one of the things that we haven't discussed in this framework, around this framework and this consultation, that seems to, it kind of was a point of conversation right at the beginning of the consultation, but has subsequently just disappeared, is the exemplary piece. Has anyone got any views on being exemplary? Stephen, you're laughing, so I'm assuming you do.
It's just, it's just coming up with a different word to replace a word that was controversial in the first place was just, it's just a laughable development. And they are trying to define those words and think about what they might mean. But this sort of sharing your practice nationally, if you're exemplary, that's the sort of thing that's jumping out from it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with Ofsted identifying exemplary practice and putting that in a report and saying you should really share this. That's great. That's how schools can network and get better. But what's naturally going to happen is this clamour to be exemplary and all the workload nonsense that goes with it. You know, if it's that if exemplary is on offer, I want to be it. I don't want to be the thing at the other end. I want to be this thing that maybe I can't ever attain, but that just, you know, that sort of comes back to the sort of unintended consequences of those words, those simplistic summaries of what we all do, which is a very, very complex job.
Yeah, I kind of got where they were trying to go with it, and that's exactly that, is to draw out best practice across the system, and you're not having to be exemplary in every area, but you might have an area of practice where you know that is seen as worthy of sharing. And I kind of almost see the point of saying that it will then be evaluated by a group of peers before it's considered to be exemplary. I kind of got where they were going with that, but I think you're right. I think there will be an unintended consequence that, you know, parents and or governors are going to say, well, why aren't you exemplary in all areas? When actually that's supposed to be the rarity. It's supposed to be to single out the real key things that are truly exceptional about a school, because you can't be exceptional at absolutely everything all of the time. But I do worry a bit about those unintended consequences. Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
I also think it will be like the outstanding. So do you remember the new system, the new framework came out, and the first school that got a graded inspection was a school in Hackney. They got outstanding, and it was to do with their use of grammar in Spanish or French or modern foreign language. And I remember all of us went, oh, as if that school got to the point where they were drilling down at the use of grammar in MFL, and that's what kind of got them there outstanding. I remember we all waited with bated breath for the report, and it was seen as this like really unattainable, really exceptional practice. And that worked, right? Because we all kind of looked at it and saw it as this amazing, you know, not many of us have got the bandwidth to worry about our children's use of grammar in MFL. I say that for myself, maybe I shouldn't speak for others. But then I feel like as the system moved forward, that then became watered down and became less about this exemplary national practice, you know, and that was an example that was shared nationally about how good this MFL teaching was. And then I feel like as things went on, it kind of became less like that, and it became more likely that you'd get a best fit, or and it might not, you know, you get the kind of little updates to the framework. Nothing was hugely changed, but it did become watered down. I think I'd say that. And I worry this is just history repeating itself. Like Stephen says, they've just switched the name out. It will start off as this amazing thing, and the first few schools that get hit, particularly as a London group, we look at those, we look for those urban schools, we read those reports, we go off, we spend loads of time on MFL and making sure our children know how to use grammar in Spanish. And then actually time ticks on, and you move down the list in your schools or your communities, kind of where you are in the program of inspections. And actually it doesn't, you can maintain that, like statistically, like Stephen said, we're all going to go for it, we're all going to try. And if you're going to make it this really exemplary thing, then that doesn't work. It's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're all overachievers. That's why we work in education.
We're ambitious, egotistical overachievers, really.
Yeah.
Jade?
I think, yeah, where I heard it the most, I think, was in Bridget Phillipson's speech, where I felt like, you know, she was obviously talking about exemplary as this rating to showcase your best practice in whatever your area was. So fine, but kind of felt like it came with a threat about the poor achievers, really. And I felt, you know, the way that came across felt quite negative. And, you know, I think she talks about them going into academy trusts, you know, and it just felt, the way she balanced that conversation felt a bit scary at that point. But yeah, I think in principle, it's nice to have an area to showcase your best practice, but you know, what does it come at the risk of?
James, you kind of heard a bit more from senior bods in various places at the DFE and Ofsted of late. What's the mood music? I think it's changeable from where I'm sat, but where do you think it's going?
I don't know is the short answer. I'd love to say I was crystal clear on everything and knew exactly how to answer that question, but I don't, frankly. I think I think it's interesting in terms of the wider context of the curriculum assessment review, and looking at where that's going, how that's navigated a very careful path so far. You know, if there was to be a sudden departure, I think we would see it in things like that. So I think whether or not that is winning kind of hearts and minds with new flashy approaches. In many ways, I'm very glad it isn't. I think they're immensely conscious of the implications of any radical changes that they could bring in, and I think that probably reflects a degree of things are going really well in the system. It may not feel like it. I constantly say doing better and feeling worse, which I think is universally applicable. But it's a system where we are really high performing despite the unbelievable challenges and stress and pressure on the system at the moment. And I just don't see that there is or needs to be a kind of major departure going forward.
No, I agree with that. I'm very mindful of time. I was hoping actually at this point, James, you'd have the answers for us all, but and I was going to sum up beautifully with that, but that's not going to happen. I think there's kind of two things that I'd kind of like to kind of bring out. And the first one is, and I think it might have been you, James, might have been somebody else, but Ofsted feels very high stakes because everybody's doing really well at it. So the reputational damage of being RI or even worse, special measures, is really, really obviously high stakes because it's a very, very small club. In our system, in our network, we're 97, 98% good or outstanding. So those that are not stand out like an absolute sore thumb, and reputationally that's very, very difficult to swallow. And yet when you look at Ofsted and other equivalencies in terms of inspection in things like social care or local authority, very few people are good or outstanding. So it's not as shameful perhaps as being requires improvement, because that's where the norm happens to be. Also, there isn't a head teacher's name on the report as well, which I think it makes it marginally less personal. But there is that piece, is that the system is doing so well. Is there going to come a point at which there's going to be a very painful reset of the system? I don't know. I think that's a speculation on that one. A few final comments on that before we round up.
I think it's quite encouraging, James's view there about not seeing in things like the curriculum review any sort of major revolution, which hopefully means that the changes that are coming our way in inspection will be similarly measured. So there is some encouragement that some of the great work over the last 5-6 years is going to be retained and built upon. That will certainly get my vote. I'm just, I'll go back to my sort of single thought about the whole thing is they can have as many descriptors and as many different ways of thinking about school life and dicing it up and saying what they think, as long as they just write a report at the end of it, extrapolating to anything else in order to provide some quantitative data. I just think it's never going to improve the lot of a school leader, and never going to improve school, and never going to drive school improvement in the way that it should. I think they're damaging, and I can't see them ever not being damaging.
Yep, that's quite clear from you, Stephen. So the Ofsted is fine, the descriptors are fine, just take away those reductive judgments. Any other final thoughts from people?
I just think there needs to be a serious move towards a localization of it. I think that's the biggest difference they could make in terms of how it feels and how it's read and how it's the impact it can have and how it's received by the local community. I think we keep saying it and we're doing it anyway, which perhaps is why it feels like an obvious thing, like you say, in London. And as Londoners, and having worked in other boroughs, it is throughout, certainly central London. But I think that's the biggest change that could be made to improve what is not a perfect system, but probably isn't any better or worse than what we've had before.
Yeah. So the kind of notion of having maybe a national HMI leading a team of more locally sourced inspectors.
Yeah, similar, like Jade said, similar to what we can see with RISE. The other thing, which I'm just going to put in there, is if you say that we're all doing well and we're all successful and we're, you say as a piece, we're all kind of achieving, there is also the breakdown between primary and secondary. And primary schools have always outperformed secondary schools at Ofsted, and in terms of data, I think, well, since I've been a teacher, that's been the case. So I don't know, more broadly speaking, is there a piece of work where Ofsted focuses more on the sector that looks like it needs more support?
Controversial there, Liz. That's a whole other conversation, is the gap between primary and secondary, and that's one
Leave us alone. We're doing all right.
I would love to have that at another time. Jade, any final thoughts for you?
Yeah, I think it is about inspectors understanding really unique challenges that schools face, and I think that only comes about people that understand the contextual, have got hands-on experience of the contextual landscape of wherever the schools are. So I agree with that. I just wish, I wanted to change. I wanted to see some change, and I wish it had been a little bit more groundbreaking, something a bit more exciting. It feels like it's not going forward, it's more going backwards.
Yeah. James, any final thoughts from you?
I mean, I think the reason we're all talking about this now is because of how much Ofsted obviously matters in the system. More than anything else, it's the thing that is that, lightning rod throughout the sector. In a way, as we said last time, it can become the tail wagging the dog, as in inspection should be the end point of the system, built on a strategy that comes from the front of the system, and people then work on and deliver. But it feels almost as though it's the other way around, isn't it? That the kind of evaluative inspection actually kind of drives what the priorities are at the front end of the system, if that makes sense. And that's and with the high stakes and everything else, it just becomes so important. And obviously we've seen such different inspection frameworks over time, and when it pushes in the right direction, it makes such a massive positive difference, albeit with challenges around the edges and everything else. But that's why it's so kind of high stakes, getting every bit right. And reflecting on that, for example, just thinking about kind of how important is the curriculum assessment review versus Ofsted for the quality of curriculum and subject leadership, and kind of conclude that, okay, if the curriculum assessment review had taken a really extreme position, then sure, it would make a big wave. But actually, in general, it's Ofsted that makes a bigger difference to these things, even when you have a fully focused review of something nationally, because Ofsted's just that powerful in the system. So that's why every nuance matters so much.
Absolutely agree with that, and I will go back to my support for Amanda Spillman and what she did around curriculum and the innovation that she drove from that. And for that reason, whatever followed, I think she should be celebrated for that, because I think, for any of us that have been in the game long enough, that has been the biggest school improvement driver that we've had in many a last decade. So in summary, we're all in support of Ofsted as a thing. There needs to be checks and balances. Wry smile from Stephen there. But what we're most concerned about is actually the variability of inspectors and how they're going to be trained, and how that is going to be perhaps addressed when issues arise. And the choice of phrases and judgments and what sits under that needs to be far clearer. And at the moment, it's a bit muddy, and that is going to cause the biggest amount of issue in the system. So, Martin Oliver, if you are listening, which I think you should, make sure your inspectors are not as variable as they might be. Think locality. RISE teams may well be the answer, and sort your words out, please. So, thanks very much. Thank you, everybody.
And that's it for this edition of HEP Talks Roundtables. A massive thank you to our panelists for their insight and honesty as they unpicked the potential and pitfalls of Ofsted's new direction. As ever, the conversation doesn't end here. The consultation closes on the 28th of April, so have your say now. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Luke Kemper. Join us next time as we tackle another key issue shaping the future of education. Until then, stay tuned to HEP Talks.